Police find a family murdered in their home. The victims are covered with strange marks. To catch the killer, forensics experts must find out what caused the wounds. A request for roadside assistance is a pretext for murder. Can telltale marks on a car battery connect the killer to the crime? Police are on the trail of a psychopath. Investigators must rely on an ordinary screwdriver to stop him in his tracks. Like fingerprints, tool marks found at a crime scene can single out a murderer. More than one killer has tripped himself up on his own tools of death. In January 1992, police responded to a call made by the neighbors of Juan and Olga Hernandez. They reported a violent commotion coming from their home. Upon entering, Chicago officers found the body of Juan Hernandez lying face down in the living room. He was apparently beaten and killed. As they cautiously searched the house, police entered the nursery. Discovered Olga Hernandez was also dead. Nearby lay the body of her 10-month-old daughter. The Hernandez home showed no signs of forced entry. The killer or killers left no clues to their identity. The detectives on Chicago's homicide squad had seen a lot of horrible crimes. But nothing in their experience could have prepared them for what they witnessed that night. From the brutality of the murders, it looked as though the killer had come there with the sole purpose of killing this family. Detective Richard Zulli was one of the detectives on the scene.
It was actually the worst beating I've ever seen. And initially, we couldn't tell whether or not it was just a beating or if there was a weapon, like a shotgun maybe involved, because there was just so much blood on the scene.
The medical examiner determined that the victims had been beaten to death with a weapon that left hundreds of U and J-shaped bruises. Neither the medical examiner nor the officers at the scene could identify what could have caused the peculiar marks. Zulli's partner, Detective John Murray, knew they had no chance of finding the weapon until they knew what it was.
Time is of the essence, because if we can identify what it was, and we were thinking of a meat tenderizer, a tire jack, all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Now it would be important to get back to the scene or the area of the murder to try to recover it.
Detectives knew that identifying what caused the marks was the first step to finding the killer.
171 dispatch, start rescue, code gray.
Whoever he was, he had thoroughly covered his tracks, leaving behind only the telltale wounds. Any tool leaves its mark on the object it manipulates. In police work, that principle is usually applied to firearms. To see if a particular gun had been used in a crime, a ballistics expert test fires it. The signature markings on the test-fired bullet are then compared with markings on the bullet retrieved from the crime scene. If the markings are the same, the case is made. When a tool is used in a beating death, the task is a similar one. By examining characteristics of a victim's wounds, experts can often prove that one tool and one tool only was the instrument of death. Hoping to identify the wounds on the bodies of Juan and Olga Hernandez, the medical examiner sent photos of the markings to the Chicago Police Crime Lab. Forensic investigator Bill Sherlock, an expert in firearms and tool mark identification, compared the marks against various tools. The wounds were consistent in size and shape, bruises left by a heavy object. But in the curved area at the bottom of each wound, the skin had been broken.
We weren't sure what type of tool it was. I was not aware of any tool that would make this kind of marks, any store-bought tool, any of the tools that are used by the various trades. So it was kind of a challenge to try and find out what made these particular markings.
After nearly a week of testing one kind of tool after another, Sherlock could not find an absolute match. The most likely weapon was the butt of an automatic pistol, but Sherlock wasn't completely satisfied with that conclusion. If used like a hammer, the butt of a pistol could have caused the bruises on the victim's skin, but not the lacerations.
The marks looked somewhat consistent with the marks from a butt of a gun. We couldn't explain why we had the tearing of the skin and why we had the shapes that we had.
A chance event provided Detective Zulli with a possible explanation. Off duty, he realized he held a likely answer in the palm of his hand.
At home one day, I was cleaning my gun. And as I'd slid the magazine out of the gun, I was cleaning it and looking at it, and I thought, gee, that's kind of similar in shape to the wounds.
With its magazine removed, the butt of a semi-automatic pistol would have thinner, sharper edges, more capable of leaving the marks seen on the murder victims. Without the magazine and its bullets, the gun would be lighter and less effective as a bludgeon. It would have taken longer to inflict fatal wounds. Sherlock tested his theory on a slab of modeling clay. The butt of a medium caliber pistol produced marks of the same size and shape as the wounds on the victims.
So now we kind of knew that we were looking for that a gun was used to do this, but we still didn't know what gun or where or anything else. That came later.
Forensics had identified the type of weapon used to commit the crimes, but could it be linked to a killer? Tapping their sources, officers on the narcotics squad got a tip from a prostitute who'd heard something on the street. She told police that a woman named Patricia Johnson seemed to know about the killings. Her boyfriend was a known drug dealer, a Cuban named Reynaldo Travieso. Police brought him in for questioning. He refused to talk. Meanwhile, detectives checked the victims' phone records. On the night they were murdered, Juan and Olga Hernandez had ordered a pizza. Questioned by the police, The delivery man said that on the night of the killings, he recalled going to the address of Juan and Olga Hernandez. But when a woman answered the door, she told him she hadn't ordered a pizza. Police brought him to a lineup that included the suspect's girlfriend, Patricia Johnson. He recognized her as the woman who'd answered the door at the Hernandez home. When Johnson was told she'd been picked out of the lineup, she admitted being at the house that night. She told police Travieso was the killer. Her willingness to talk was a stark contrast to her boyfriend.
He was stoic and friendly and very polite, but a guy that could sit upright in a chair for hours and talk to you freely.
Murray questioned Travieso again. Years of interviewing suspects have taught the detective to read subtle gestures that could reveal more than words alone. But Travieso wasn't playing.
If you were conscious like we are very often on the body
language,
English,
right.
very, very, very important, this guy showed nothing, a real sociopath.
But police were sure he knew something. A witness had ID'd his girlfriend who had turned on him, and he was named by an informant. As detectives turned up the pressure, Travieso decided to come clean. The story had begun 2 years earlier when he and Juan Hernandez came over from Cuba together. They planned to get rich dealing drugs. But that wasn't how it worked out, at least for Hernandez.
Both were in the drug business. And as time went on, the murderer became quite a bit more successful in the drug trade than the victim.
In their first year of business, Travieso had supplied Hernandez with 1 kilo of cocaine to sell. The street value was approximately $20,000. But the drugs disappeared and the money never materialized. Travieso demanded payment, but Hernandez held him off. A month later, Travieso decided to give Hernandez a second chance and gave him another kilo to sell. But that too disappeared. Travieso had trusted Hernandez, and his trust had been betrayed. Now it was time to collect. Patricia Johnson's statement confirmed that Travieso had used the butt of his gun to kill Juan and Olga. The confessions had come as a surprise, but the law demands more than a confession to ensure a conviction. At trial, the defense could argue that a confession was coerced, or the defendant could recant it. To make their case, police needed to provide corroborating evidence. They needed to find the weapon. Johnson had told police she'd wrapped the gun in a plastic sack. From a moving car, she'd tossed it off a bridge into the river. To aid divers in their search for the weapon, Zuli and Murray crisscrossed the bridge, tossing out stones of similar size and weight as a medium caliber pistol.
John and I spent a day driving across that bridge with rocks about the same size and weight of a medium caliber weapon. And we drove across, throwing them out of the squad car and into the river. And noting that they were all landing about the same distance from the bridge in about the same place.
To coordinate their search, divers stretched polyester rope across the river, forming a grid. It took them less than half an hour to find the sack containing the gun, near the spot where Zuli and Murray had tossed their stones. The weapon was a .32 caliber semi-automatic pistol. With its magazine removed, police believed it could have caused the unusual wounds on the victims' bodies. But to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, the detectives needed harder evidence, evidence only a forensics expert could provide. Police divers in Chicago had found what they believed to be a murder weapon in a plastic bag. Cuban immigrant Juan Hernandez had taken drugs to sell on consignment, then never delivered the cash. Now, he, his wife, and his infant child were dead. Bill Sherlock of the Chicago Police Crime Lab attempted to establish the gun as the murder weapon. Not as a firearm, but as a tool used to bludgeon the victims to death. Sherlock had already determined that the unusual wounds on the victims' bodies were most likely caused by the butt of a semi-automatic pistol with its magazine removed.
As we're looking at the marks on the victims' heads, it's consistent with the tearing being with the front portion of the magazine well, the thinner metal, the side wall, and also the magazine release back here, the serration from the magazine release.
At first glance, Sherlock believed the pistol found by divers could have caused the wounds. To make a positive identification, he obtained a copy of the autopsy photographs, being sure they were exactly to scale. He then obtained a 1-to-1 transparency of the butt of the gun with its magazine removed. He placed the transparency over the life-size photograph of the wound. After closely comparing the gun's metal edges with the cuts on the victims, Sherlock felt he had a perfect match. His testimony could now remove any doubts about the statements of the two defendants. He'd forged an irrefutable link between them and the tool of death.
What it was invaluable for was in bringing this case into court and having a solid piece of expert testimony to present in court to the jurors and say, this is this because this is the results of my tests. It's a lot more powerful than Detective Zulli or Detective Murray standing there going, geez, it looks the same, I think it's the same. They were able to show conclusively that it was the same.
Reynaldo Travieso's pistol became a bludgeon by accident. He'd come to the home of Juan Hernandez, hoping one last time to get the money he was owed. But Hernandez didn't have enough. Travieso put the pistol to his head and pulled the trigger, but the magazine jammed. Enraged, he resorted to beating his victim. In the process, the gun magazine fell out. When the pizza man arrived, Travieso had already begun beating Juan Hernandez with the butt of his gun. But the unpaid debt hadn't been satisfied. After Juan was killed, Olga Hernandez would also die, along with the baby she did everything to protect.
And clearly, in examining the scene, it was apparent to us that Mrs. Hernandez was doing what she could to try to protect her child during the course of this attack. That involved a whole emotional thing that you have to deal with too on the scene. You know, when you recreate the scene and you're visualizing what happens, you're creating all this. So you can imagine the terror and the fear and everything else that was happening.
Hopefully we'll never see them on the street again.
No.
Tool mark evidence had made a critical difference in putting Reynaldo Travieso and Patricia Johnson behind bars. Both were sent to prison for life. In Louisiana in 1984, police had to rely on more subtle tool mark evidence to crack a case of murder. Responding to the report of a shooting in the small town of Zachary, 15 miles from Baton Rouge, police found a car with its hood raised, parked at the side of the road. Nearby lay the body of George Thompson, shot at close range with a shotgun. No one witnessed the shooting, and the killer left no obvious clues. But battery cables dangling from the front of the victim's car gave police an idea of what had happened. One end of the cables was still attached to the victim's battery. Had he been the one who needed a boost, or had he stopped to help someone else? The victim's car started without any problem. Apparently, he had pulled off the road to assist another driver. If police could find the second car, they might also locate the killer. A Baton Rouge detective visited the wife of the victim.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Detective Tom Harris. I just have a couple of questions to ask about your husband.
She had gone to church on the night of the murder. When she returned home around 10 p.m., her husband told her he had to help someone start his car. He left without saying exactly where he was going. According to Lois Thompson, her husband rarely went out that late. Whoever it was he was going to help must have been a close friend. Lois Thompson never saw her husband again. It seemed to police that the call for assistance was a trap. They suspected the killer may have lured the victim to the crime scene with a plea for help. If so, the battery cables might bear the killer's fingerprints. They were sent for examination to forensic expert Pat Lane of the Louisiana Crime Lab. He placed the cables in a fuming chamber designed to make latent fingerprints visible. But the test results were negative.
Well, we didn't come up with any fingerprints on any of the clamps or the cable. So essentially, the fingerprint examination was a washout, and I thought that I was going to be through with this evidence at that time.
The case stalled until a few days later, when detectives got a phone call that brought them a lead. The caller told police to check out a parking lot at an apartment complex in Baton Rouge. Police found a yellow Buick that matched the description of the second car observed by a passerby prior to the murder. It belonged to Brenda Perkins. The tip was placed by her neighbor, a relative of the victim. Faced with suspicion of involvement in a murder, Perkins was more than willing to talk to police. Detective Bernie Taylor of the Zachary Police was at the scene.
One of the questions that, naturally came up is, well, have you been having trouble with this car? Perhaps, battery trouble.
The car had a brand new battery. Perkins told police she'd had no trouble starting it.
So at this point here, we kind of fits in with our thought that, hey, this was a set-up deal with no car trouble to begin with. He just was lured out there under that pretense.
Perkins explained that her uncle, Earl Thomas, had borrowed the car on the night of the murder. Thomas was the brother-in-law of the murder victim. But Brenda Perkins had even more damaging evidence. The day of the murder, she'd gone shopping with Earl Thomas. He'd made only one purchase, shotgun shells. Perkins asked him why he needed them. At first, he said for hunting. But with deer season several weeks away, she prodded him to tell her the truth. He said he planned to murder his brother-in-law, the victim, George Thompson. A receipt found in the trunk of Perkins' car totaled $2.97 plus tax. Brenda had noticed both the size and brand name of the shells her uncle had purchased. To check out her story, the detectives went to the same store and purchased a similar box of shells. The amount on the receipt was $2.97 plus tax. Exactly the same as the receipt found in the car. Lane also found Thomas's thumbprint on the shopping bag. The detectives now had circumstantial evidence that Earl Thomas was the killer, but they required something more solid. They looked for what they needed under the hood of the victim's car. Through forensics, they hoped to turn a scratched piece of soft lead into hard evidence. In the murder of George Thompson, Louisiana police were building their case against his brother-in-law, Earl Thomas. Had Thomas set a trap for Thompson, calling for help and then killing him? The case was missing one crucial element, a way to link Thomas to the crime scene. Booster cables were still attached to the victim's car battery. If the victim had time to attach the cables to the killer's car, the clamps may have left marks on the battery. The battery of the car driven by the suspect, Earl Thomas, had fresh tool marks, apparently made by a booster cable. Police asked forensic examiner Pat Lane to see if the marks were made by the cables found at the crime scene. It was the only way to place the suspect's car at the scene. Just like people, every tool leaves behind a unique fingerprint that can be used to identify it. The suspect's battery not only had bite marks left by the teeth of a booster cable, it also had a scratch, apparently caused when the cable was hastily removed. Lane suspected that a single tooth on one of the jaws of the cable may have caused the scratch. To test his theory, he took the cable found at the crime scene and made test marks on a flat piece of lead. A comparison microscope enables him to examine two sets of marks at the same time. On one side were the marks on the suspect's battery clamp. On the other, the marks made by the victim's battery cables.
The ultimate determination in any tool mark examination is, was this tool or this instrument responsible for making a particular mark? And in this particular examination, my determination was the mark that we see on this clamp here in the monitor and this reference mark that I know to have been made by the jumper cables have the same source.
Tool mark evidence had placed the car driven by Earl Thomas at the scene of the crime. A warrant was issued for his arrest. But Thomas had gone to California. His address was unknown. Detectives traced all the calls he made to his sister in Baton Rouge to a public phone booth in East Los Angeles. Within days, he was picked up at the booth by Los Angeles police. They didn't have a hard time spotting him. He was a tall man, missing his left arm. Detective Bernie Taylor and his partner Charlie Clark had already pieced together how the killing occurred. The victim was married to Thomas's sister, but was being unfaithful. To uphold the family honor, Thomas decided to put a stop to his brother-in-law's philandering once and for all. He borrowed Perkins' car, then called the victim, pretending to need help. As the victim clamped a booster cable to the battery of Thomas's car, Thomas retrieved his shotgun.
Told you to leave her alone.
It was a nice theory, but Thomas denied any involvement in the crime. Detective Clark was concerned a jury might think a one-armed man incapable of firing a shotgun.
You ever do any hunting?
Oh yeah, I love to hunt.
Yeah.
Oh,
What kind of hunting you do? Deer? Squirrels?
just generally hunting.
Yeah.
It's just fun.
What kind of gun do you hunt with?
What's shotgun?
But Thomas's gift for gab tripped him up.
Well, what do you think?
I think he's a con artist. Earl was a con artist. He rambled. If you ask him about the case, then he would start rambling on something else. And so we decided we knew that he did hunt. And so we started asking about his hunting. And so I asked him, well, Earl, how do you handle that shotgun when you only got one hand, you know? And Earl said, well, I just put this arm out like this and lay that shotgun on it here and steady it. And he said, no problem.
Man, I told you to leave her alone, man. Don't do that to her, man.
Earl Thomas successfully entrapped his brother-in-law with his scheme. But the hunter also unwittingly snared himself. The scratches from the clamp marked Thomas as the killer.
This lead clamp, a $1.98 piece of lead, put a man in jail for 20 plus years. When Bernie Taylor brought this piece of evidence into the laboratory, I knew exactly what he wanted before he ever finished the request. And I told Bernie at that time, I said, Bernie, it's theoretically possible, but I have to tell you it's a long shot, but we'll give it our best shot. And ultimately, this piece of evidence was linked to not just one pair of jumper cables, not just one clamp, but to one tooth on one clamp of that pair of jumper cables.
Let you get back in, get set.
In the small town of Zachary, solid detective work turned a case of circumstantial evidence into a conviction based on forensic science.
And so the challenge to us is to find and to establish the link from the crime scene to that individual. And when that takes place, there's usually not cameras and lights, there's not a lot of glamour. There's a tremendous amount of satisfaction in going home at night and knowing that the work that I've done has made this town a little bit safer place to live in.
Thompson's death was the result of a personal vendetta. But in Florida in 1990, murder became a terrifyingly random event, and police were paralyzed by lack of clues. On August 26th, students were returning for the fall semester at the University of Florida in Gainesville. On that Sunday afternoon, Ricky and George Powell went to the campus to see their daughter Christina's new apartment. But when they arrived, neither their daughter nor her roommate answered the door or telephone. The parents asked the building manager to let them in, but the women had changed the lock. The manager didn't have a key. The Powells' concern grew with every hour their daughter was away. Fearing the worst, they contacted the police. A Gainesville police officer met them at the apartment. He then forced open the door. As he entered, he saw a dead woman posed on the couch. He blocked the parents from following him. He didn't want them to disturb the evidence, and he feared the killer might still be inside. But the officer found not the killer, but a second murder victim. Both women had been raped, then stabbed. The brutality of the crime and the way the bodies had been staged made police fear that they were dealing with more than a random killer. Whoever murdered these women was cunning and methodical. Police feared it would only be a matter of time before he struck again. To help investigate the brutal double slaying, police throughout the county assisted the Gainesville police. Among them was Detective Sergeant LeGrand Hewitt of the Alachua County Sheriff's Office. And then the killer struck closer to home.
About midnight, Sunday night, one of our records clerks at the Alachua County Sheriff's Office failed to show up for work. Her supervisor and co-workers got concerned about that and notified our watch commander.
A deputy was sent to Krista Hoyt's apartment. No one came to the front door, but he saw a gap in her Venetian blinds.
The deputy got on his knees and put his flashlight up into the room that was there, and it happened to be Krista Hoyt's bedroom, and she was sitting on the side of the bed in a staged position, decapitated.
Adding to the horror, 2 days later, 2 more victims were found, raped and stabbed in a similar fashion. News of the killings electrified the University of Florida campus.
It's currently 27 minutes past the top of the hour. Just a reminder for University of Florida students back for the new semester, make sure you stay safe, keep doors and windows locked. Call SNAP, the Student Nighttime Auxiliary Patrol, if you need an escort around campus. Police are increasing patrols in the southwest Gainesville area around student apartment complexes.
Special Agent Ed Dix of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement recalls the mood in Gainesville at the time of the killings.
The city of Gainesville sort of started feeling a sense of terror, and the university has some 40,000 students, of which probably 20,000 or more are females. Parents started coming to get their children. It wasn't enough that they called for a well-being check. They actually just started showing up. The kids were calling home saying, "I'm ready to go," to the point that the university was closed for a week.
The police feared a ritual killer was on the loose. A serial madman who'd claimed 5 victims in 3 days. In each case, he forced his way past the locks on the doors. At the first location, he jimmied the lock of a wooden door. At the second and third locations, he'd removed the security pin from a sliding glass door. Special Agent Ed Dix believed the same tool had been used at the last 2 locations.
The sliding glass door had been broken and pried and had left some marks in the aluminum.
The police photographed the damaged areas around each of the sliding doors where the killer had gained entry. A section of the wooden door frame from the first location also was removed and sent to toolmark examiner David Warniment at the crime lab in Jacksonville. Experience told Warniment immediately what class of tool had been used to enter the victims' homes.
And the question was what type of tool was used to make the damage in the door sections from the first crime scene. I looked at them and could tell the investigators initially that they were looking for a 5/16 inch screwdriver with a type of blade that has a serrated tip or a corrugated type of tip on it.
Police removed the doors from the second and third crime scenes and sent them to the lab. They suspected the crimes were linked, but had no evidence to prove it. If they could match the tool marks found at the 3 crime scenes, they could prove the same person was responsible.
A week later, 2 doors came into the laboratory. The door from the second crime scene and the door from the third crime scene. I looked at the doors and found that there was damage around the lock on the door from the second crime scene and also on the door jamb which came in with it. On the door from the third crime scene, there was also damage around the lock. And also I found that there was damage up around the security pin. There was a series of scratches in the security pin, around the security pin hole. And what I noticed was they were very typical, and they appeared to have been caused by trying to jimmy the door and remove the security pin and gain entry.
Warniment made a silicone cast of the damage on each of the doors. The silicone is mixed with a hardening agent. When it sets, it forms a perfect impression. After studying the impressions from the 3 crime scenes, Warniment concluded that the killer used a screwdriver with a 5/16 inch serrated blade. Police now knew that they were dealing with one killer who used the same screwdriver to break into his victims' homes. If they could find the screwdriver, they would find the killer. Over the next 4 months, throughout Florida, if a suspect was arrested with a screwdriver on his person or in his car, the tool was sent to David Warniment. Examined under a microscope, even the blade of a brand new screwdriver leaves a striated mark that's totally unique. It becomes more distinctive over time, acquiring the nicks and scratches that come from use. But after examining dozens of screwdrivers, Warniment found nothing that matched the tool marks at the crime scene. Police had few leads and no immediate suspects. A killer was on the loose, and they feared that more women would die. In November of 1990, 4 months after the first murder in Gainesville, police got a break from a routine computer check. A man picked up in Ocala for robbery was wanted in Shreveport, Louisiana for shooting his father. The computer had already identified Shreveport as the scene of a crime very similar to the murders in Gainesville. It might be a coincidence. But Special Agent Ed Dix decided to look for a connection between the suspect in Ocala and the Gainesville murders. Meanwhile, Sergeant Detective LeGrand Hewitt was following a different lead. Months earlier, shortly after the murders, a bank in Gainesville had been robbed. It was not far from the second murder scene. Shortly after the robbery, police officers saw 2 men enter the woods nearby. The suspects eluded police, who called for backup. a tracking dog was dispatched to pick up the scent. It led police to a small makeshift campsite. There, they found a large number of dye-marked bills, apparently stolen in the bank robbery that day. In a duffel bag, police found a semi-automatic weapon like the one used by the robber, some duct tape, and a cassette player. On the tape was what seemed to be a veiled message. The man on the tape identified himself as Danny Rolling. He sang a total of 11 songs he'd written himself, mostly to the tune of The House of the Rising Sun. The tape ended with what was possibly the chilling prelude to murder. This is not the road I wanted, but I will walk it like a man. I got something I gotta do. The tape proved that Rolling had been in Gainesville at the same time the killings occurred.
Looks like some blood on the gloves.
At the campsite, police had also found a screwdriver. But at the time, there had been no reason to suspect Rolling's involvement in murder. His apparent MO was bank robbery, a crime far removed from brutal sex crimes. At first, the screwdriver wasn't examined.
The investigators had said it was essentially a screwdriver from a campsite that was occupied by a bank robber. And at that time, no one attached any significance to the campsite. But there was evidently something in the back of my mind that just said, told me not to eliminate the tool.
Warniment decided to take a closer look at the screwdriver.
I placed the tests on from the screwdriver from the campsite on the microscope, and also my silicone casts of the marks from the door from the third crime scene. And within about 5 or 10 minutes, I all of a sudden saw a tremendous correspondence of individual characteristics and thought to myself, I've just identified this screwdriver as making the damage on the door from the third crime scene.
He performed a similar test on the sliding door from the second crime scene.
And again, compared them directly to the screwdriver blade in this case, and I was able to see enough correspondence to say that the screwdriver from the campsite caused the damage on the door and the door jamb from the second crime scene.
The tool marks proved that the screwdriver found at Danny Rolling's campsite was the same tool used to break into the victim's apartments. Faced with the mounting evidence against him, Rolling decided to reveal the criminal life he'd led. As a burglar, he developed a talent for breaking and entering houses while the occupants were asleep.
His whole life, I suppose since he was a teenager, he had spent as a peeping Tom, and then as a burglar, then as a rapist, and he was extremely good burglar. He seemed to enjoy breaking in with people in the house, the cat burglar scenario, and enjoyed being able to go in there and do whatever he wanted to do without waking anyone up.
Like so many other serial killers, Rollings had begun as a peeping Tom, peering in women's windows in the dark. Then he became a cat burglar and progressed to murder. His break-in tool of choice was a screwdriver with a serrated blade 5/16 of an inch wide. He was proud of his ability to open any door without a sound. From there, it was apparently one short step to rape, then murder, culminating on the night of August 26, 1990.
He said as he was peeping in the windows, he saw a girl changing clothes or just come from the shower. which turned out to be Tracy Paulus. And he said when he saw her, he knew that she was the one, his choice for the evening.
The knife Rolling used to kill his victims was never recovered. Instead, police had found a much more valuable tool. Rolling had left 27 scratch marks on the doors at the crime scenes. It was more than enough to prove his guilt.
It is further ordered and adjudged that the defendant, Danny Harold Rawling, is hereby sentenced to death. The defendant is hereby committed to the Department of Corrections of the state of Florida for execution of this sentence as provided by law. May God have mercy on his soul. Done and ordered this 20th day of April, 1994.
Tool mark identification is perhaps the simplest weapon in the Crime Stopper's arsenal. Requiring little more than a visual comparison. But for juries, it's compelling evidence. If a tool can be traced to a suspect, only a few faint scratches may be enough to solve the crime.